Have you ever wondered how the United States government really formed its early policies? We often hear stories about the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and epic battles. But there is a huge piece of the puzzle that is frequently left out of the mainstream narrative. The powerful and persistent resistance of Native American nations. This isn't just a side story. It's a central force that fundamentally shaped the political, legal, and military landscape of the early United States. Let's uncover how this resistance wasn't just a reaction to expansion, but a proactive force that compelled the U.S. government to define its own powers, create new laws, and even question its own identity. Before we dive in, it's important to understand the landscape before the United States even existed. North America was a continent of nations, hundreds of distinct sovereign indigenous peoples with their own governments, laws, trade networks, and diplomatic protocols. They weren't just tribes wandering the wilderness, they were complex societies. The arrival of European colonists didn't change that. In fact, European powers like Britain and France had to negotiate with these powerful indigenous confederacies, treating them as political equals. Alliances were crucial. For example, the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, held the balance of power in the Northeast for centuries, playing the French and British against each other. This established a long precedent of treaty-making and diplomacy that the newly formed United States couldn't simply ignore. When the American Revolution ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, the United States claimed vast territories stretching to the Mississippi River, but there was a major problem with this claim. Native nations who actually lived on and controlled that land never signed the treaty. They hadn't been defeated, and they certainly didn't recognize American authority. From their perspective, the U.S. was just a new, aggressive neighbor making audacious claims. Immediately, native nations from the Ohio Valley to the Deep South began to organize. They saw the threat posed by waves of American settlers who, unlike the more controlled British colonists, were now flooding over the Appalachian Mountains, hungry for land. This brings us to one of the most significant, yet often overlooked, conflicts in American history, the Northwest Indian War. After the Revolution, the U.S. government was weak. It was broke. Its army was tiny, and the Articles of Confederation gave it little power to stop states or individual citizens from provoking conflicts with native nations. American settlers pushed relentlessly into the Ohio country, a land promised to native nations by previous treaties. In response, a powerful confederacy of nations, including the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and others, united to defend their homelands. They were led by brilliant military and political leaders like Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee. Initially, the U.S. government thought it could simply steamroll these nations. They were wrong. In 1790, an American force under General Josiah Harmer marched into the heart of the Confederacy's territory. They were decisively defeated. The next year, 1791, the U.S. sent an even larger army under General Arthur St. Clair. What happened next was the single greatest defeat of the U.S. Army by indigenous forces in American history. At the Battle of the Wabash, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket's warriors inflicted over 900 casualties on the American force, virtually wiping it out. This catastrophic loss sent shockwaves through the U.S. government. It was a national crisis. President George Washington and his administration realized their policy of simple conquest was a disastrous failure. They couldn't afford the war, and they couldn't win it. The resistance forced a complete policy reversal. It compelled the U.S. to acknowledge that native nations were sovereign powers that had to be dealt with through diplomacy and treaties, not just military force. This led to the Indian Intercourse Acts, a series of laws that established a crucial legal principle: only the federal government, not states or individuals, could negotiate for native land. This was a direct response to the chaos caused by illegal land grabs, and a direct result of native military power forcing the government to centralize its authority and try to control its own citizens. The government was forced to build a professional army, the Legion of the United States, to counter the military prowess of the Confederacy. This crisis essentially created the modern U.S. Army. Eventually, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, this new, well-trained army defeated the Confederacy. But even in defeat, native resistance had forever changed American policy. The resulting Treaty of Greenville in 1795 was not a simple surrender. It was a negotiated settlement that established a firm boundary line, and the U.S. government explicitly recognized the title of the native nations to the lands they still held. It set a precedent for all future land cessions. Land had to be purchased through formal treaties. The idea of conquest was replaced, at least on paper, by the idea of purchase. This pattern repeated itself in the South. The Muskogee or Creek Nation, led by the brilliant diplomat and warrior Alexander MacGillivray, also presented a formidable challenge. MacGillivray, who was of Creek and Scottish heritage, skillfully played the Spanish in Florida against the Americans in Georgia. He built a powerful Creek confederacy and resisted American encroachment on their lands. Georgia was aggressively seizing Creek lands, and the weak federal government couldn't stop them. MacGillivray's resistance was so effective that it forced President Washington to personally intervene. In 1790, Washington invited MacGillivray to New York City, the nation's capital at the time. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States summoned a Native American leader to the capital for a state visit. MacGillivray arrived with a delegation of Creek leaders and was treated with all the ceremony of a visiting head of state. The result was the Treaty of New York, the first treaty between the U.S. and a native nation negotiated under the new Constitution. In this treaty, the U.S. guaranteed the integrity of Creek territory against illegal settlement by Georgians. While the treaty was ultimately broken, it demonstrates a profound point. Creek resistance forced the U.S. federal government to assert its authority over one of its own states, a key moment in the development of American federalism. The power of native resistance was literally shaping the balance of power between the federal and state governments. Even the Supreme Court's most famous rulings on Native American sovereignty were a direct result of indigenous resistance. In the 1820s and 30s, the Cherokee Nation adopted a strategy of legal and political resistance against the state of Georgia's attempts to seize their land. They had their own written constitution, a newspaper, and a formal government modeled on the U.S. They weren't fighting with weapons, but with words and laws. 8. Took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. In the landmark 1832 case, Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the Cherokee. He declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community, and that the laws of Georgia had no force within their territory. This was a stunning legal victory born directly from Cherokee political strategy. However, it also revealed the limits of American law. President Andrew Jackson famously defied the court's ruling, reportedly saying John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. This led to the tragic Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee and other southeastern nations. But even in this horrific outcome, we see how native resistance exposed a fundamental crisis in American governance, a clash between the judicial and executive branches, and attested the very rule of law the nation claimed to uphold. The resistance didn't just challenge land claims. It challenged the integrity of the entire American political system. From creating the U.S. Army, to establishing the supremacy of federal law in Indian affairs, to shaping the balance of power between federal and state governments, Native American resistance was a driving engine of political development in the early United States. It forced a young, insecure nation to define its borders, its laws, and its own authority. The story of early America is incomplete and inaccurate without acknowledging these powerful indigenous leaders, diplomats, and warriors who fought to defend their people and, in doing so, fundamentally shaped the country we live in today. Their legacy isn't just one of tragedy and loss. It's one of profound influence and undeniable impact. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on American history valuable, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the stories that truly define our past. See you next time.